Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest this week is Alice Grist. Welcome, Alice.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, you're welcome. Alice is the author of 3 books. Her first book was The High-Heeled Guide to Enlightenment, which saw Alice, I was tempted to say fall down a rabbit hole, but which saw Alice explore alternative spirituality from her modern-day fun-loving perspective. The second is Prediction Magazine award-winning book, The High-Heeled Guide to Spiritual Living. Following Alice's dabbling with different faiths, she decided to forget all of them and simply live spiritually. This book is a fiery and funny account of just what she learned. And then her third book, Dear Poppyseed, a Soulful Momma's Pregnancy Journal, is a personal, spiritual, and very human account of her first pregnancy, recently published. Alice is a contributor to various magazines and the Huffington Post and so on, and is a publisher. So we'll maybe touch upon some of that stuff. She lives in the UK with her husband James, baby daughter Ivy, and 2 cats, Molly and Jimmy. Jimmy, Jimi, was named after Jimi Hendrix, and her husband happens to be a rock musician. I just talked to him while getting her microphone and stuff set up. So, now the subtitle of this show, Alice, as you probably know, is Conversations with Spiritually Awakened People. And I probably should change that to awakening, because awakened has this sort of finality to it, which makes it sound like you can't get any more awake than you are. And my experience in talking to all these people is that we're all on the journey. Everyone is still evolving, growing, deepening, clarifying, whatever you want to call it. And there, from my perspective, is no end to it. So, your first book, High-Heeled Guide to Enlightenment, might imply that you are enlightened. And I don't know if you would go so far as to say that.
No, and don't we all go back to sleep sometimes as well?
Yeah.
Like every night, all as awakened people. It's quite easy to nod off.
Well, actually, at a certain stage, awakened people don't go back to sleep. Their body sleeps, their mind sleeps, but inner awareness is retained throughout sleep. So, that kind of is an indication of, the fact that there are stages to this game, and we're all growing in it. But I have friends who haven't slept in decades.
Lucky them.
Their body sleeps, they snore, but the inner awareness remains, the self remains awake to itself, despite the dullness of sleep. Yeah. So I understand from, having poked around in your books a bit that, at a certain stage you were, the most unlikely candidate to be writing books like this. You're, kind of a party girl and just concerned with fairly superficial things. And then at a certain point, like most of us were at a certain age, and then at a certain point things began to wake up for you.
Yeah, I was really lucky as well, because I had a phase of, being the party girl and being obsessed with shoes and whatnot. But actually, my early life was completely different to that. And my dad was the local vicar of the Church of England church. So I was brought up as the vicar's daughter for a good few years. Following that, he left the church. And he kind of, I guess, wandered in the wilderness for a little while, but was still feeling very faith-led. And I think he did probably similar to what I did, was experiment with different faiths to try and find out what was right for him. And then the vicar became a Wiccan high priest in the end. So I was brought up, obviously, initially with that very formalised Christian faith, and that moved through to a pagan tradition faith that I was brought up as a teenager with. And so he taught me, and with his wife, my stepmom, and they taught me all about things like tarot and healing and meditation, which I absolutely loved and adored, and particularly as a teenage young woman, I just really, really got into that. And it was a little bit later on, I guess, when you become a bit too cool to be doing what your parents do. And I went off to university and things like that, and you start this party lifestyle that I'm sure you're familiar with over the pond, and that's very prevalent here in the UK as well. And just, the last thing I was thinking about was anything faith-led, and it was just the weekend, and what I was doing that week, what I was wearing, where we were going on a Saturday night, that kind of thing. But yeah, it got too much. It kind of, the joy of it very quickly ran short and started to go a bit rusty, and I was looking, as so many people do, looking for something more, and that's what took me back to my childhood and took me back to what I learnt there. And not just in terms of spirituality, but in terms of who am I? There were a lot of things I explored at the same time, like writing, and that's how those two things came together. And writing was something I enjoyed as a child. Other silly things like acting. I had a brief stint as an actress at the local amateur Amdram society at the same time. But the thing that kind of stuck with me through all of that was the spirituality and the writing, and kind of came together.
Yeah. So what is your current understanding of what spirituality is? And maybe you could lump it in with enlightenment also. How would you define those terms, since you use them in the titles of two of your books?
Yeah, the more I get asked that question, the less of an answer I have, because it is so fluid and changeable. I think right now, being a mother and being someone who's been a mother for now 11 months, spirituality for me right now is very much, it's moment to moment. It's what happens with my little girl. It's the relationship, the bond I have with her. It's life in itself. She is life. She's my life. And that has completely consumed me. And I think that living in the moment is very powerful. It's something I talk about in both of my spiritual books, and it's something that I guess I've struggled to do. I think we all struggle to do at the beginning of our spiritual paths, but having Ivy has absolutely thrown me headfirst into that reality, and so to me spirituality at the moment is moments. It's perfect moments with her. I've just got back from Tunisia. I had a perfect moment which wasn't to do with her, actually, a few days ago, where I went into the sea, and I was in the sea for maybe 10 minutes, and it was just blissful, just to have that silence and that peace, and to be connected to every single one of the elements. And I just thought, wow, when was the last time I did this, and it was quite awe-inspiring. And yeah, like I said, that was 10 minutes. It was a very brief, short, spiritual moment, but I just think that it's almost like this rolling thing for me at the moment. Everything, life is spiritual, and that's what I talk about in my books is, I think there's a habit sometimes in the spiritual community and people to say, oh, well, that's not very spiritual, and this isn't very spiritual, and oh, that person didn't act very spiritual when they did such a thing. Or, you hear the phrase, oh, and they call themselves spiritual. But actually, isn't everything spiritual? The chaos, the drama, the beauty, the babies, the sea, I guess that's kind of where I'm at the minute, is every single thing that happens in our lives, that we create, that happens to us, or, is all part of a bigger spiritual pattern that we kind of have to muddle through some days.
Well, as the saying goes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So obviously, 10 people could be sitting at a bus stop, and there are 10 different experiences being had there, and for one of those 10 people, it might be a profoundly spiritual experience just sitting there at the bus stop, and the others are like, oh God, I got to go to work, and it's a rainy day, what a drag,
And you've got to find the spirituality in that if you want to become a spiritual person. And I think everyone's a spiritual person. I sometimes even get annoyed at the term spiritual because I think it just can't even encompass what we're talking about. But I do think, everyone, like you're saying, has a completely unique take on spirituality, and that's one of the things I talk about in my books is please God, Goddess, don't look at me as any kind of guru or expert. It's, I'm experimenting as much as the next person, and I want my readers to be able to look at their own lives and say, okay, I like where Alice is coming from, but for me it was this, it was A, B, and C, and it was these events, and look at it in that way.
Yeah. This Buddha at the Gas Pump tends to do that also, because if a person really gets into it and starts listening to a lot of interviews, there are so many different flavors on basically the same ice cream, but there's so many different flavors, and after a while you kind of relax and get comfortable with the fact that there are, many paths up the mountain, if we want to use that metaphor, and that you have to kind of find the one that works for you.
Definitely. Yeah.
But of course it all points back to, something I alluded to with the bus stop example, and that is shifting your subjective perspective such that the spirituality inherent in each moment is appreciated,
And that's the journey.
Yeah. Cleansing the windows of perception, to quote William Blake.
It's a big dose of therapy. That's one of the things I say in my books, is particularly my first book, going through all these different faiths and taking from them what I found interesting and what worked for me. It was really, I could have gone to a psychologist for a long period of time and probably had the same kind of result, or to a therapist or a counsellor.
Maybe.
Because, I find it so empowering, but you have to sort of sift through all this rubbish that's going on in your head, and I think all of us get mired in that, and the society kind of promotes it. And it's very difficult to step away from, the way our society expects us to be, the way our brains have just become out of habit, and to kind of get to the essence of who you are. Mm-hmm. But it's also so worth doing.
Yeah, and why would you say why do you think it's difficult?
I think we're just so mired in stuff. It's, the brain is a funny creature. It can be molded and it can be changed, but it can take a little bit of time, and it can be very, very difficult for people to even realize there's anything wrong with the way they're thinking. Mm-hmm. And you can look across a section of humanity, and some people will be more enlightened and more aware of what's going on in their mind, and some people just really won't have a clue. And yesterday I was on a plane, and there was a lady in the seats behind us, and bless her, she was clearly quite drunk, and she was clearly had lived a difficult lifestyle. I mean, I can say so much. She was just a woman sat behind me. I really don't know what was going on with her, but I was just guessing, and from what I could hear her saying, and she felt very sorry for herself, and someone had asked her to stop smoking, one of those pretend cigarette things.
Oh, yeah, like electronic cigarette or something, yeah.
And she was just devastated by this, and she was crying, and she couldn't understand, and she thought everyone thought she was a bad person. And then 5 minutes later, she was offering her husband sex acts, and I heard all of this.
On the plane?
And I was thinking, dear Lord, what's going on behind? And I just thought, this woman, I'm not here to judge her. I just thought she's so far removed from the existence that I know in my life and in my body and in my mind. And I thought, I wonder if she and I were to sit down and to try to have a conversation about maybe, spirituality, how that would go, because bless her, she's in such a different existence. And that's why I think it's so hard for some people to kind of get through this mess of life experiences that's in their heads, and work a way towards something more enlightened.
There's a Native American saying, which you've probably heard, which is, don't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his moccasins.
Yeah.
Moccasins are a type of shoe that the Native Americans wore. And it's life is intense for most people. I mean, even for people who have it pretty good, it can be very intense. But for billions of people, it's extremely intense, and the circumstances the circumstances into which one is born are often so challenging. I mean, look at that factory collapse in Bangladesh recently, and the lives those women lived, and so on. And so, one wonders about the accessibility of spirituality as we are defining it to most people, because most people it's just a matter of survival, and dealing with, horrible long hours of work and, poverty and hunger and all kinds of stuff. And I don't mean to sound morbid, but you got to have compassion for people, what they're up against. And
it's a difficult world, and that's one of the things I talk about in High Heel Guide to Spiritual Living, particularly, is the chaos and the darkness, and the fact that I think so many people look, probably because of the religious example that's been set, that sort of presents heaven and hell and this idea of light, which is a lovely idea, but when people are living very difficult, dark lives, the idea of light can seem very, very far away. And I think sometimes we have to dig into our suffering to actually find any kind of light, and even then it might only be the smallest chink, and you have to kind of grasp that with two hands. And I think some people, like you say, who've lived very, very difficult lives may not even be capable of doing that at this particular moment, and maybe something will happen later down the line and they will be. But I believe that everyone's given opportunities time and time again. But again, alongside the fact that life is very difficult, I think we live in a culture that makes it very difficult to have any kind of faith, because popular culture in particular, and this is for people who haven't even had difficult lives, popular culture consumes us with thinking about shopping and what we're going to purchase and all of that consumer stuff, or what we're going to watch on television at night and who the latest singer is and what they like. And they probably like fast cars and women. So, there's anything, spiritually is, again, far, far removed. And that's the audience that I'm kind of trying to write for, is the people who are consumed in popular culture, and where I was, who I believe would be interested in something to do with faith, who probably go around and say things like, "Oh, it happened for a reason," and people say that kind of thing quite offhand.
Glibly, yeah.
Yeah, but have they ever stopped to think what they actually mean by that? Because there's actually a huge amount of meaning behind that, and they're kind of confessing a belief in more to life and all kinds of things when you say something as simple as that. And it's just, taking that and exploring that and looking at it more deeply.
Yeah, I think the points that we're touching on here actually are they're kind of the tip of the iceberg of something that's very deep in the nature of creation, which is that, in order to individuate at all, there had to be a sort of a hiding quality that came in. If we think back to the Big Bang and, somehow a manifestation coming out of an unmanifest field of potentiality, the very process of manifestation was one in which, things became specific, isolated, localized, and in that localization, the unboundedness was lost, as if the ocean were kind of somehow lost in a drop. The word Maya in Sanskrit, and it's a very powerful force, and everyone is caught up in it to whatever extent. But just as that's a very powerful force, and there's a very kind of powerful pull to come back to the source, and we have that ingrained in us as much as we have the tendency to sort of go more outward. We have the tendency to go inward. And at a certain point that tendency kind of awakens, when I think maybe when the outward tendency has run its course to a sufficient degree, like you were saying in your younger years, when just a certain point the outward thing didn't do it for you anymore. And so there's a kind of a waking up to, there's got to be more than this.
And you see people searching for meaning and connection all the time. Facebook, who'd have thought it? But, people are going on there maybe to, perhaps they use it sometimes in an unhealthy way, but also, doesn't it connect us with all the other souls practically on the planet? And isn't that maybe a little bit like going home? And maybe, people perhaps say too much on there, but maybe it's just a need to be heard, a need to connect, a need to share. And then, there's also an awful lot of fantastic stuff you see on there, spiritual stuff, and that might awaken people. And Facebook is one example. And obviously you've got the internet in general brings together this mass connection.
Yeah.
As much as the internet can be used for some horrific things, it's also can be incredible and quite exciting how humanity can connect almost in an ether-like place that's almost like perhaps where we will go later.
Well, you were talking earlier about how in your youth you went through a lot of different religions and spiritual paths and checked them all out, but there was a time when that wasn't really practicable for anyone. You grew up in a little village someplace, and you just were all you knew were the traditions of that village, and maybe that had its sort of charm and simplicity and value. But these days we have a global village, and we're all exposed to everything by virtue of the internet and other means of communication. And I think that personally, I think that's more of a blessing than a curse. I think it sort of enables us to. I think it's actually technological means through which a global awakening is happening.
Yeah, and like you say, there are bad things on the internet, but doesn't that just demonstrate how diverse we are, and also brings the scum to the surface, and hopefully the beings of light, or the people who give a crap, can sort that out and change humanity for the better and say, hey, look, this is the worst of us and this is the best of us, and we're all here on this one internet television screen thing. Let's sort it out and sort of go towards the best of us. Because I do think people say, I know in England at the minute this big thing about paedophilia, and lots of our television stars are being named as having committed sex crimes and stuff maybe 20, 30 years ago, and all kinds of stuff is going on the internet about that. And it's surely got to be for good. And you kind of look at it and think, well, there never used to be any kind of paedophilia years ago. Well, there probably was, but like you said, people lived in tiny little villages, and it wasn't blasted all over the internet for everyone to see. And so it's got to be a good thing. It's got to be a good thing.
I mean, even that building collapse in Bangladesh, now there's a big outcry about the worker conditions, and not only the Bangladeshi authorities, but the American companies, the Western companies that are employing these people to get them, the minimum possible wage, are being blasted for their collusion in that tragedy, and so change is afoot as a result of even a tragedy.
Absolutely.
Later this summer, I might interview the couple who put together the movie Thrive. Have you ever seen Thrive?
No.
It's a very interesting movie, but it sort of, at first it gets you really discouraged because it outlines just how messed up everything is and how these really powerful forces seem to be in control of everything, and the banking system, and how they don't give a crap about the environment, and anything for a profit, and you kind of get the feeling, what can I do? I'm just one little person, and even the people who are concerned about this stuff, what can they do? Because these forces seem so powerful. But then towards the end of the movie, it gets into a much more optimistic vision, and when I interview these people, I hope to take it even a step further with them, which is that the most powerful thing, ultimately, is the most subtle. I mean, physics tells us that. The subtle, the atomic is more powerful than the molecular, and so on. And the subtlest thing of all is what we refer to as spirituality or consciousness. It's more, and being more subtle, it's more influential. And so if change can be affected on that level, there's really nothing which can stand up to it, and that change is occurring. And I think that a lot of the crises that we're seeing on the surface levels of life are actually just the readjustments that are having to take place as a result of that deeper change that's welling up.
Yeah, it's almost like little bubbles of mania that need to pop.
Exactly. And if you think about it, there's so many different institutions and economic and social and so many different things that really don't, whole industries that really don't deserve to exist in an enlightened world. They have no intrinsic value. They just harm people or harm the environment. And so, it would stand to reason that those things are going to start getting kind of shaky if there really is a global awakening taking place.
And you do seem that does seem to be happening. On all kinds of levels. And I just think, we might have to live through some interesting times, possibly some dark events. But again, it's just providing space for change. Yeah.
I forget who said it. It might have been Thoreau or Emerson or something. It was like, may you live in interesting times.
Well, I think that's definitely happening.
Yeah. And I think the reason this is worth talking about is just that if you don't have this perspective, it can be rather disturbing. You can feel like, oh my God, what's happening? There's no hope for humanity and so on. But if you kind of do have this perspective, then you can interpret things differently and perhaps see things which others might despair over as being signs of hope.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've written some articles that have sometimes been rejected for that very reason, because I've kind of come from the place, everything happens for a reason, and therefore some really, really bad stuff can mean good things, and people sometimes aren't ready to hear that, and then they're kind of reel at that, and they're like, well, how can you say that? These people are suffering, and it's not taking for granted that suffering, because I get as upset about suffering as the next person. I always have been very sensitive towards other people's pain, but I do still believe that pain can, whether it's personal pain or societal pain, can make the biggest changes and the most exciting changes, and sometimes we kind of have to suck that up and move and flow with that.
Yeah. Well, if we kind of recognize or acknowledge or believe or experience that there is some, cosmic intelligence that permeates and orchestrates everything, then it's hard not to accept that everything happens for a reason. And if things do seem capricious and arbitrary, then I guess the person who sees things that way doesn't really grok the notion that there is some kind of cosmic intelligence orchestrating everything. I don't see how the two could fit together.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess a lot of the time you get people saying, oh, well, if there was a God, how does, why does he let children die? Why does he kill my nana? Why does he allow war? Well,
Yeah.
I think that's just a misunderstanding of God, and I think, again, that's probably based on a religious fundamental view that God is a little fella in the sky who's kind of got it in for us a little bit, but loves us, And I think that, obviously, I don't believe in a God like that. I think that there's a more interesting forces abounding.
Yeah. I think my answer to that would be, well, basically what you just said. It's not an old guy with a beard in the sky, but if there's my concept of it. In fact, I have a friend whose daughter was killed in a car crash about 15 years ago, and she had just had a baby. The baby was about as old as yours is now, and she was killed suddenly. And my friend has never gotten over it. She's just still grieving, and she has a really hard time believing that there is any sort of God that could allow such things to happen. And I do my best to buck her up and give her a philosophical perspective on it. But my perspective is basically that God is all-pervading. That which I refer to as God is. There's no place where that intelligence cannot be located in the midst of in every iota of every situation, every planet, every galaxy, every subatomic particle. It's just one solid mass of intelligence, and so all of this is happening within that, and it's actually, if we want to consider that it's happening to somebody, it's happening to that, by that, that is interacting within itself, and our conversation is that talking to itself, and the poor women in Bangladesh in that building are that, having that experience, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big.
Yeah. So tell us a bit more about your books, and about yourself in the process of telling us about your books. I don't mean to talk as much as I am, but sometimes it kind of goes that way. And my wife is signaling me that I'm talking too much. But admittedly, since I interview a person a week, and I didn't have a chance to read all of your book, so give us some books, that is. So give us some highlights of what you would like people to know about, your path and how you've chronicled it in these books.
Okay, the books, I really want them to be, I really wrote them to be, loose and interesting and very much like talking to me. So a lot of people who know me will read the book and they're like, Alice, it's just like having a conversation over coffee with you. I want them to be accessible because I am trying to reach people who, like I spoke about before, popular culture, people who are young, women particularly, but I think guys can read them too, and it applies the same. It really doesn't make that much difference. If they can put up with a pink cover, that's fine.
If they're secure in their masculinity, yeah.
But yeah, they're fun books. I like to think they're funny and humorous, but at the same time there's a great deal of depth there, probably more than the reader might expect with the title. The High Heel Guide to Enlightenment, that was the first book that I wrote, was very much my take on all kinds of different subjects. So, I went to Buddhism school, I explored Wicca, obviously I was brought up with Wicca, but I explored it a little bit more, things like Kabbalah and spiritualism, and a whole bunch of other things like tarot and crystal healing things, divination things, and just explored them really to see what they could bring to me, because at that point in my journey I was still in a place where I was trying to get myself better, trying to get myself in a happier place, and actually the amalgamation of all of those things really did help me. And I think the key towards the end was really love and everything that brings, and finding love for myself and love for other people and love for life really, was massively powerful. And so the journey is there within that book, via all these different faiths. And it can be quite comical, I think, at times, me in my high heels turning up at Buddhism school and having to take them off and potter about and stuff like that, but then also the depth that I found within each of these religions and how they personally affected me, because I didn't want it to be, oh, hi, my name's Alice and I'm going to tell you about Buddhism. There's a billion books out there about Buddhism. There's a billion books, about all these different subjects. I wanted it to be an experience that I had, that I could write about, that was very personal, that I knew that women and men my sort of age, and not necessarily my age, but in my generation, and maybe a generation either side, could really grasp and understand and bring themselves to an understanding of spirituality. And so, yeah, that was the first book. That was the journey that I took there. But by the end of that book, I guess I didn't feel that affiliated with any of those faiths or any of those particular things. And what I wanted to do next was just to live spiritually. I just thought, can't I just live spiritually? Can't I just make my own rules up? Why do I have to, have a book that tells me what to do, or a Bible, or a list of mantras I absolutely have to repeat every single morning? High Heel Guide to Spiritual Living is my second book, and that was very much about my decision to just go, okay, none of those other faiths suit me. I mean, I loved them and they taught me so much and they brought me so much happiness, but I just didn't quite feel at home in any of them. So I thought, well, sod it, can't I just be a spiritual person? Can't I just have, invite spirituality almost into my life and just say, okay, I'm spiritual, and see what the heck happens next? And that's basically what I did. And that book is again, it's following that journey, that path of what happened to me when I did that. And I guess there was a misperception on my part that oh, I'm spiritual and therefore I'm holier than thou and nothing can ever touch me, and life's going to be so much nicer from now on, which of course was the exact opposite. And life at that point decided to become quite chaotic and quite intriguing, and I guess it was though I had to ride all those bumps. And the book actually turned into 11 lessons, sort of ranging from the mind and mental health and everything that I had to overcome there, which then moved on to chaos and perfection and life and physical stuff as well, to do with my body and what I was eating, and diet, and committing to be a proper vegetarian, and all kinds of things moving through the book. So there was like 11 lessons that came out of that journey for me, and I learned that being a spiritual person isn't as simple as just putting a hat on and going, hey, I'm spiritual. It's more rigorous as well than reading any kind of text or adhering to any kind of list of top 10 how to be spirituals. It was almost like I took a great big brush and completely brushed my head out and brushed my life out and just changed everything. And so that is really what goes on in the High Heel Guide to Spiritual Living. It's that next stage. It's the decision to be spiritual made manifest in one woman's life. So yeah, that was an interesting trip, and I hope that again there's comedy in there as well as hopefully a good deal of wisdom. Fingers crossed. I like it, so. And then the third book, Dear Poppyseed, that's out actually in a couple of months, in July.
The thought that came to my mind as you were saying that was that it's like there's a saying that my former teacher used to say is, when the postman knows you're going to move, he tries to deliver all your mail. In other words, when a deep shift takes place in your spiritual orientation, then all the surface stuff has to be rearranged in order to accommodate that deeper shift. And so, like you said, you kind of had the attitude that, oh, well, if I just wake up, everything's going to be smooth and groovy, and I'll be a spiritual person. But that's actually very often when the work really starts, because there's so many things that are out of alignment with a deeper spirituality that have to change. And that, we tend to get a little bit ingrained in our habits, and some of these things could go back decades, if not lifetimes. And so, a lot of rearrangement has to take place, a lot of shifts.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And that's actually something that kind of, when you talk about things that go back lifetimes, that just rings a bell with me, because in my first book, The High Heel Guide to Enlightenment, I had a past life regression, and it turned out that I was a nun, and it was such a powerful experience. It was incredible. I've got a cat here, by the way.
Oh, I often have mine on my lap during the... In fact, she was on my lap during the... Is that Molly or Jimmy?
This is Molly. She likes... As soon as the baby is out of my way, she's like on my lap. She just absolutely... She was my first little girl, and I think she feels quite jealous. But anyway, sorry. I had this experience, the past life regression. It turned out I was a nun. I was a nun in a orphanage who looked after babies all the time, and it kind of explained my mild dislike for babies, which I'd had previous, obviously, to having Ivy, and previous in my life. I'd kind of always thought, well, I never want a baby, hard work, horrible. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way, but this kind of, I didn't expect that to come up, because I didn't have a phobia of babies, I just wasn't keen. And it's almost quite strange as I look at my spiritual path that's taken me from having, exploring different faiths, to then going through into my second book, The High Heel Guide to Spiritual Living, and having to do this work that you're talking about, to become a spiritual person, and it's, or a more spiritual person, and all the crap that you have to clear out of your life and out of your brain and out of your heart and soul, and body. And then at the end of that, the third book, and, books aside, in my life, I got pregnant and had a baby, and it's the best thing that ever happened. And it wasn't where I saw this journey going, not at all. Probably, if I'm honest, when I wrote the first book, I probably thought I was going to become a best-selling author, and maybe enlighten a few people along the way. The second book, I probably realised that wasn't the way things were going. It was more about a personal journey and what I had to shift. And then the third book was actually, hey, this is real life. You're going to have a baby and you're going to like it. And it's not going to be like when you were in a nun in the first book. So it's interesting how these things come about, and it's not quite how you expect. But again, can be so consuming, whether that's because you fly off to Bali or something, and doing yoga noon and morning and night, or whether because you're experiencing spirituality, as I feel I am at this particular moment, through having brought in a new life. And I've probably just gone way off what you actually said there.
No, not really. And I read some of the passages in your book, your new one, which isn't published yet. You sent me the manuscript, about your love for your baby, and it was really moving. It's not. I've never had a child, and even if I had, I don't think it would be quite the same as a mother's love, the intensity and depth of that. But it was very beautifully expressed, and perhaps the depth and intensity of it was augmented, or by the spiritual foundation you had built, in the last decade or whatever. It was beautiful,
Well, I feel very connected to it, and I felt very connected to her years before she was even born. There was a period, like I say, where I wasn't particularly keen on babies. I didn't think I'd have one or wanted one. I just saw them as a bit of a nuisance. And then after I'd had that past life regression, I did kind of move to a place where I was started to get a little bit broody and, sort of fantasize about what it might be like. And I always thought about this daughter I was going to have. I was going to have this one daughter. I didn't want any more, just this one daughter. And that's kind of what manifested itself, whether that was because that was what was meant to be or otherwise, I'm not sure. But I always felt very connected to her, to her spirit, to her soul. I know a lot of people will say that when they had their children, the child comes out and they don't know them and they have to get to know them. Whereas I feel with Ivy, I knew her from before she was even conceived. And I still feel that. And so she doesn't surprise me. I feel very, very connected to her. And yeah, the love I feel for her far surpasses anything I've ever felt in my life. It's absolutely incredible, and I'm sure many mothers will be able to attest to the same thing. It's absolute. I've gone on this spiritual path. The first book, the second book, brilliant, mind-altering, world-altering stuff, but nothing compared to meeting that little girl. You know, it's just absolutely overwhelming and astounding, and words don't describe it. And I've got to be careful now, because I could just sit and talk here about how amazing it is for the next however long. But yeah, I think when I look at spiritual growth, she's given it me more than any of it, more than anything I've tried to get for myself. You know, just being with this little person and being consumed by her and living moment to moment, and just the purity of it all.
That's beautiful. It's a point that I don't know if has ever been brought out in any of my interviews. You know, motherhood as a spiritual path, and how powerful and profound it can be. It is, and it's. Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing it out. Yeah.
Do you know what, Rick? It's heartbreaking as well. It's absolutely heartbreaking, because you're so in love with this child. And then you look at all the other children, and you kind of feel this love for them as well. And then you look at all the people, the adult people, and you think, well, they used to be like Ivy, you know, so I've got to love that. You know, they're incredibly lovable as well, even the really awful, horrific ones. And then you start looking on a wider scheme, and you see all the awful stuff that goes on in life, and it's horrendous. And you know, you can really take it to all kinds of extremes. You know, I'm quite a feminist kind of person. I get frustrated now that the whole idea of motherhood has been kind of just made to be nothingness by our society, you know, and instead we worship business and economics and, you know, building stuff and war and no offence, man stuff. Everything that man has achieved has kind of been put up on a pedestal, whereas things like motherhood has been put way down here. And it's like, isn't it the most important thing in the world? Because, you know, it's with the mother that everything starts. Yeah. And that you can form people and, you know, hopefully make a better human race. And so, yeah, this whole motherhood thing, and it's all very internal. I don't particularly go out espousing these views very often. In fact, it's probably the first time I've actually said them, because it's all going on up here quite a lot of the time. But as a spiritual awakening of its own, you know, in part you've got the one-on-one relationship with the child, and then all this other stuff that comes on the back of that, and humanity and the sake of, you know, everything that's going on. It's kind of crazy. And like, I'm only 11 months in. So.
Yeah. There's a saying, personal love is concentrated universal love, you know. And you were saying about, you know, I have so much love for this child, but how about all the other children? How about all the other people who were once children, and so on and so forth? And I think it's completely natural for a person to have intense personal love for their child, you know, because we are universality, but we're universality in an, you know, having taken an individual form, and the individual form performs its individual functions, one of which is to, you know, love its individual offspring. And obviously there are people who assume a lifestyle which by its very nature is more universal, such as, you know, somebody like Mother Teresa or something. And of course she was at an older age, but there have even been young people like that in their 20s and 30s who have had this sort of universal role to play and have had a much more equal vision of all people and love them unconditionally and so on. But, you know, that's their role. And so, I mean, if your role, you shouldn't feel in the least bit imbalanced or selfish or anything because your love for this one little being is so great, and you're being neglectful of all the other 7 billion. You know?
That would be a lot of work.
Right.
A lot of nappies to change.
Yeah, really.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it has really altered everything that I thought I was and that I thought I was going to do, and I'm sure it will continue to do so. And, you know, since having I've spent quite a lot of time kind of wrestling with myself. You know, what do I do next in my career? What's my next book? What's my next this? What's my next that? And I don't know anymore, and I'm kind of okay with that. You know, because, you know, I've spent so long trying to promote my books and spent so long trying to think about what that next thing is career-wise, and it's just got to the point I just don't care anymore. You know, that's just the honest truth. And I know I probably shouldn't say that on a radio show where I'm actually talking about my books, but it just doesn't seem to matter anymore. And it's really nice doing this interview because I think we booked it like a long time ago, didn't we? So,
yeah.
I've moved. I mean, whenever we booked it in, I was probably in a very different place then, and I was still in a place where I was trying to promote my stuff and get it out there. And obviously I still will do that when opportunities like that, like this, come up, where, we've booked it and it's there and it's great and I get to talk about spiritual stuff and that's really nice. But I don't know, I just feel like I've moved on to a different plane of existence almost, and I forget that I've written books, and I forget, that anything exists other than Ivy and that relationship, and that's just the honest truth. So
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
And if we really want to be in tune with all the spiritual platitudes that we hear so commonly, then that's totally perfect. I mean, you're in the now. You're doing your dharma. You're serving the function which you're meant to be serving at this time. Whether it's the function you're going to be serving 10 years from now, who can say? But it's certainly not unspiritual in the least, and I wouldn't say it's any less spiritual than some guy who's sitting in a monastery, and meditating all day long or something. It's that saying how they say that ordinarily we're human beings having spiritual experiences, but really we're spiritual beings having a human experience.
That's where I'm at.
That saying. And I think we can actually take it even a step back and say we are being itself, not spiritual, because spiritual beings that in itself is isolated, but we are being itself, having human experiences, cat experiences, baby experiences, just sort of knowing itself through all these forms.
And I think sometimes we can search too hard for spirituality, and actually it's not quite our time yet to float off into the ether. So why? We're here in human bodies, having all our human feelings and, I guess all the good and the bad that comes with that for a reason. And sometimes I think it's too easy to try to escape into some mental version of spirituality, to try and get away from our lives as they are. And actually, it was better sometimes to just throw ourselves into our lives and forget all the rest and just get on with what's in front of us. But then I'm in a very happy place. That's really easy for me to say that at the moment. And I understand not everybody is, and sometimes I had to do the work to get to where I am now. And like you say, who knows? That might not last. It might change. It might be that I'll suddenly have an amazing idea for the next book, and bang, that's it. I'm back on type. I really don't know, but I'm fed up with thinking about it, because I was trying, to look after my little baby, and at the same time wondering, so what's next for me, without really recognising for a little while that what was next for me was what I was doing right there and then. And as soon as I kind of accepted that and recognised it, my life felt a lot calmer, and I felt a lot happier, and and recognising that Ivy's the most important thing for however long, forever, maybe.
Yeah. There's this book called Collision with the Infinite by Suzanne Siegel, and a phrase she repeats over and over in the book is, do the next obvious thing. And she had a spiritual awakening, which really frightened her because she didn't know what it was, but because there was a sudden dramatic loss of ego. But, after that spiritual awakening, she went on for a decade, sort of still trying to figure out what had happened to her, but, raising a daughter and getting a PhD, and her mantra was, do the next obvious thing. And the reason I like that is that if we again acknowledge that we're swimming in an ocean of intelligence, then things are divinely orchestrated. Things happen for a reason, and so whatever it's like the world can be your guru if you recognize that that is the case, and sort of take advantage of what's offered to you. In this case, a baby daughter.
Yeah, and I'm literally, I like that what you just said. I mean, I'm literally counting on that. I don't have the time with looking after Ivy to go out and look for anything, whether it's a pizza or a guru. I'm kind of hoping they're going to find me. Seriously, I just don't have the time. I don't even know how to begin to think about that. And it's quite interesting, recently I was thinking, I'd really like to go to a sweat lodge, because I love doing sweat lodges. I've done a few of them, and I haven't got the time to think about that at the minute, or even to get involved in sending an email. And I saw some friends of mine on Facebook, they were talking about sweat lodges, and I was quite envious, and I thought, I'd love that. But I didn't do anything about it. And then like 10 minutes later, I got an email from my local sweat lodge master saying that I was welcome to come to the next one, which is actually next weekend. And it was like, oh, yeah, think about it, and it happens. Obviously, that was meant to be. And I guess anything else that I think about or, allow my mind to dwell on and it doesn't happen, I'm just kind of, okay, that's not meant to be at the minute. And I just, I like to think that I'm swimming in a place where it's meant to be will happen, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. And it's a nice place to be, and it is, it's a different place to be, and it has affected things, things like ego and mind. I think we all struggle with that, but again, having Ivy, I haven't got time for that either. Really.
Well, that brings out a nice point too, which is that if we are going with the flow, so to speak, or if we're cooperating with the flow of intelligence that is, displaying its beauty all around us, then very often we find that when we have an impulse of some sort, a desire of some sort, that it manifests quite easily. And there's that whole thing of trying to do that willfully and visualizing and putting little stick-em notes on your mirror and the secret, that whole thing. But it really can be much more spontaneous and natural, I think, than that. You're just kind of rolling along, and whatever you need, maybe genuinely need, an impulse will come, and then that will get fulfilled. Sometimes it gets fulfilled even before you know you need it.
Yeah. I struggle with all the manifesting stuff. I find it really difficult, and I know there's so many people out there telling you how to manifest money, how to manifest better houses, that it's okay, and also at the same time telling you it's okay to be spiritual and manifest money or manifest jobs, and it probably is, but it's all a bit convoluted, really. And I kind of think, why don't you just sit back and see what actually happens? Because that's what I've had to do, because I've tried to do all of these things, and look, here's my board. I did this ages ago, but the only thing that I actually care about that came true on it was this little baby face there.
Yeah,
baby, well, sexy mama. That's quite embarrassing.
I suppose that part was necessary for that part to happen.
Yeah, no, I did that. I don't normally do things like that, but I did it, and I just kind of think, actually, I then forgot about it and let it go, and that's probably the more powerful thing to do. And I think sometimes things like The Secret, it probably works, and for some people it will work particularly, but maybe they're more in tune with what their natural path in life should be anyway. And I think you can get confused if you're not in a good place in your head, and you can try to manifest things that perhaps aren't right for you, or perhaps aren't right for you at this moment in time, and they're not going to happen, or they will happen and not make you very happy. So I'm just in a place where I'm literally doing nothing apart from looking after Ivy. We'll see.
Well, there's a couple of things come to mind. One is the saying, deserve then desire, I mean, if we just go around desiring Cadillacs and jewelry and stuff, it can be a little bit cart before the horse. There has to be a sort of a level of deservability, and then the desires which arise will be the appropriate ones, not necessarily some societally prescribed ones. And another thing which you said triggered a thought is that in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there's this process known as sanyama, and it has to do with firstly having the awareness established at a very subtle level of pure consciousness, and then having a desire but letting it go. Having a thought, having an intention of some sort, but not pursuing it outward, rather just sort of letting it melt back into the self, melt back into consciousness. And that, just one more thing that triggers is in the Gita, there's this phrase that Lord Krishna says, curving back on myself, I create again and again. And Krishna, of course, is supposed to be the Lord of the universe, and so he's saying that I do this, I create this universe not by sort of outward effort, but by curving back on myself. So I think that all pertains to what you just said.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. That does actually, and it's again, since having Ivy, I've had so many thoughts, and just let them go. And I know that some of them might come to something one day. But I'm just trusting, and that's what I do these days. I feel like I've got myself spiritually in a good place, a happy place, I'm happy with Ivy, and then the rest of it, I just know, I just have this faith, it's going to flow, it's going to happen, and it's really not my problem. At the minute, it's not my problem up here. It will just, and I think I spent that much time in my life trying to make things happen up here. We all do it, and it's just a waste of energy. It's like worry. What's the point in worrying? What's the point? It's the same thing to me. It's that desperately trying to control things with the mind. And actually the best way to gain any kind of control is to just stop that and to stop the mind from doing those kind of things, because it's a futile exercise a lot of the time.
I mean, it's a question of understanding who's really in charge. Is our mind really running the show?
We'd like to think so, a lot
yeah, we'd like to think so, but that's sort of
gymnastics to try and get it to do that. But
yeah, and what we're really doing is it's a sort of thievery where we're assuming the authorship of action, which actually doesn't rightfully belong to us. It belongs to something deeper than our individual sort of ego and intellect and mind, and kind of melting back into a more surrendered or cooperative way of functioning.
Yeah, definitely.
And I can think of examples of people who are in your situation, a young mother who feel frustrated by what about all my hopes and dreams, what about I wanted to be a famous authoress, I wanted to be a rock star, I wanted to blah blah blah, and it may seem sexist but to say so, but I kind of feel like you really got it right in terms of just living the role that you're playing to the fullest, and just not worrying about that other stuff so much right now, because that's not what's happening. This is what's happening.
And I'm lucky. I wrote books and stuff before I had Ivy. I mean, I wouldn't say I was a famous authoress, but I'm certainly an authoress. So I've done that, but. There are other places I would probably like to take it, but it just doesn't, like I said before, it just doesn't matter anymore. I think having a child, and you were talking about the spirituality of motherhood, it just is, like I said, it's overwhelming. It just takes over, it puts this new perspective on things, and it completely shifts, all that other desires and ambitions out the door. But like you said, there are lots of people who do probably feel those drives and ambitions. And I guess for them, as for anyone who's had a child, it's not going to be the right time. And maybe for them, as it is for me, it's an exercise in laying back and seeing what happens in their world, because people can still achieve things with children.
Sure.
It might not be straight away, and it might, they might have to learn to juggle. Who knows? But, life, it could go on for quite a long time after having a child, and, maybe their days of becoming a famous author are so going to be when they're 50 rather than when they're 30.
Yeah. Hey, I'm 64. I feel like I'm almost, I will be in the fall, but I feel like I'm just sort of coming into a phase of life which is, most fulfilling I've had yet, and everything is kind of led up to this,
Well, society's so skewed. It kind of puts all this pressure on the young people to achieve stuff, and then you turn the television on and everyone's young, and there's this pressure that you should have achieved something by the time you're 18. It's like, I didn't even know anything when I was 18, and it's just ridiculous. I was just having fun. But isn't that what 18-year-olds do? Unless you're Justin Bieber and you get paid a lot of money for it. And he's probably having his own little crisis from what I can
he apparently can't handle it very well.
No, but who could when they were 18,
right.
I don't even think he's 18, bless him. I think he's 17, but that's his path. But I think there's this pressure on the young to achieve so much, and school particularly. What do you want to be when you grow up? Well, does it really matter? Because you might change your mind anyway by the time you're 30 or 40 or 50, and you might go back to university when you're 16, qualify as a doctor. Who knows? People can change their mind, probably should, because probably what you decide to do at the age of 18 ain't for you for a lifetime. That's a scary thought, if we all did what we thought we were going to be when we were 18.
I think I wanted to be a rock star or something at that point.
I think I want to be an actress.
One other thought that comes to mind based on what you've been saying about your daughter is that in some traditions it's understood that after there's a certain degree of establishment of self-awareness, self with a big S, universal self, then that provides a foundation for the development of the heart. And and so it would almost seem that your life has followed that pattern, and that the opportunity for developing your heart has been your daughter, who has, given you a taste of a much more profound love than you had ever, or at least of a different sort than you had ever known, and so in that sense also this motherhood thing is very profoundly a spiritual practice.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Yeah, on so many levels, it's like indescribable, really, and she's very addictive as well. The whole thing is just, it's incredible. I'm going to do that thing now where I go off using lots of big words about how amazing I am. But it's just, it's difficult to describe because I'm still in the middle of the beginning of it. It's going to go on for the rest of my life. But I don't know, she's powerful. Being around her is powerful. I remember when I was pregnant, I had a dream, which I think just describes quite how powerful she is. In that I knew I was having a little girl, but I was still quite early pregnant. And I dreamt that there was this grown woman came to me and said, "Mum, can you change my nappy for me?" And it was a grown woman, and she was there, and I was thinking, yeah, all right then, come here. And she showed me how to do it, and she must have been 30 or 40 in this dream. She was by no means a young person, and I was perfectly happy to change her nappy. And then for some reason I walked into a bathroom and there was like a bidet, and somebody had done a toilet in the bidet, and I was really angry with them. I was like, why do I have to clean up other people's mess? But I was so happy to clean up her nappy, and
this is all in the dream. Yes?
Yeah. Oh, thank God. But that's my life now. For the rest of my life, I'm going to be happy to clean up this girl's messes. I think was the message of that dream, and it's just to suddenly devote yourself when you've lived a life that's very much your own, which we all do, and I guess for men that goes on infinitely. Even if they become a father, there's still that slight removal from the child, probably. I don't know. I'm not a guy, but yeah, to suddenly devote yourself wholeheartedly, physically, mentally, time, your energy, everything, 24/7 to one person it's mega. It sounds like it is exhausting, but it's absolutely mega. It's incredible, and it is. It just I still haven't quite got the words to describe it, and maybe that'll be another book somewhere down the line. I don't know, but I like the way you described it.
I forget how I did. Oh, in terms of the devotional unfoldment, yeah,
and the heart getting bigger. I feel like
these
days I need to carry my heart like in a trailer at the back or something and drag it along because it's so huge. In love with her.
Yeah. And as you're saying much earlier in the interview, I think you were saying every experience we have makes an impression on us, and they talk about the term neuroplasticity, how every experience kind of changes the brain somewhat. And so, imagine how transformative the intensity of that love is on your whole makeup, the intensity of what you're experiencing, how nourishing.
Well, I feel so completely changed already, and I know I've got a lot more probably to come. I was meditating with Ivy, actually. I was nursing her, and she was kind of asleep. So I thought, I'll take 5 minutes. I don't get much time to meditate these days. And I was meditating, and it was almost like I connected with her soul. And we had a conversation, and we were talking. I said, why are we here together? And she said that she was here to challenge and to change me. And I said, oh, right. I don't know about that challenging bit, but anyway. But why am I here for you? And she said, to inspire me. And I just thought that was so interesting. And that was a week or so ago that happened. And I'm just left with that, and there's a warmth from that because it's nice that I have that purpose for her, and for me, that sounds definitely interesting.
Yeah. Well, what you just said reminded me of a question that's been kind of percolating for the last 10 minutes or so, and they say you can't choose your parents. But again, in some traditions, it's understood that you do choose your parents.
I think you probably would, yeah.
Yeah, you think, okay, well, this particular couple and this mother, this father are going to be conducive to helping me work out what I need to work out, and achieve the next stage of my evolution. And perhaps there's some whole history that you have with this particular being, and so on. And and like you say, she feels like a very powerful being or a very powerful soul. And I mean, that alone, you know, if we think of examples in history, just to, I don't know, this is what comes to mind is, you know, did Ramana Maharshi's mother waste her time, you know, focusing all of her attention on a baby, you know? Well, look what that baby ended up doing for the world, or Jesus, or, you know. So, and even if, obviously, if your daughter doesn't become some great spiritual leader or something, you know, I'm just playing with the thought.
Maybe her daughter will.
Yeah, you never know. I mean,
you just don't know, do you?
Right.
You know, and the thing is, it's how many people do you need to connect to? How many people do you need to change? How many lives do you need to change to make a difference? It can just be one.
Exactly.
You know, whoever you are, and you know, I'm lucky that I've written books and people have read them. But I do feel blessed in that respect, and that I was ever published is amazing. But right now, the idea of affecting her life is far more prevalent and far heavier weight on my soul than any of that, you know. And hopefully whatever she takes from that upbringing, because I know with my parents they certainly made me who I am, and had they not been the way they were, I wouldn't have done what I've done. And I guess that passes down now to her, and you know, and then she will pass that on to her children should she have them, and maybe it's all just part of those little ripples that ripple out and change things.
Yeah. You know, the closer you can influence, the closer to the source you can influence something, the more influential you can be. Like if you could change the course of a river way up near its source, you know, you can really change it. But if you try doing it way down near the delta where it's going into the ocean, it's too late. The river has already flowed that way. You know, so, I mean, obviously we can be very influential, as you're implying, on huge amounts of people based upon how we raise a child, you know?
Yeah, and you know, I'm all about how I raise her. I mean, I hadn't thought about it that much before I had her. I was more obsessed with being pregnant and the whole, you know, romance of that, because that was a beautiful experience and, you know, connected to the soul. But then, yeah, I do want to raise her in a spiritual way, and I want to raise her with so much love, which isn't really difficult, as you might have guessed. But, you know, and I just want her to be a wise little soul. I'm not going to pressurize her to be a wise little soul, but I think she already kind of is, and, you know, to bring out the beauty of life for her and see what she does with that, you know. And I'm very much into attachment parenting and being attached to her and letting her know that she's loved and adored, and so that she feels safe to go out in the world and do whatever it is that she decides to do. And yeah, but without putting any pressure on her to do that. You know, I might even homeschool her and things like that. And
when you were pregnant with her, was there a particular time, say several months in, where you suddenly felt her soul enter the womb?
I did.
Yeah.
It was what was it? It was very, 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 very early on. Well, I actually felt her implant in me, and I was convinced. I knew from the beginning that I was pregnant, but I kind of kept trying to convince myself I wasn't, just because I didn't want to get disappointed. And I kind of knew, and I'd have dreams, and I'd see this little baby's face. But then, the day before I took the pregnancy test, I was on a course, a shamanic training course, and we did a shamanic journey to, I can't remember where, to the underworld. Went down under, and basically within that, I was suspected I was pregnant. I didn't know for definite, and within that shamanic journey, I went into the jungle, and I was kind of hanging out there with some big animals. And then all of a sudden, this spirit came to me, and it was a man, and it was, you know, a kind of Tarzan almost type character, is how I could describe him. And I knew he was the spirit or the spirit guide or related to my unborn child that I suspected I was pregnant with. And at that moment in time, he just came, like, moved into me. And it was one of the most mind-blowing experiences of my life. And afterwards, we kind of came out of the shamanic experience, and we all had to go around the group and kind of talk about what had happened. And I could barely speak. I was shaking. It was really profound, really profound. Obviously, this is all in the diary, because Dear Poppyseed is the diary of my pregnancy. And so all of these kind of things are in there, as well as, you know, the other weird stuff I had, like stingy nipples, you know, really down to earth, gritty stuff as well. But yeah, that was yeah, I felt this spirit moved into me, and at that moment I knew I was pregnant. And then that night, randomly went to a cage fight because my husband's friend was in a cage fight, and I just remember feeling so like nervous there because it was kind of brutal male atmosphere, and I kind of knew I was pregnant. I did the pregnancy test the next day, and yeah, there she was. So it's weird how you kind of know these things, or some people know these things.
Yeah, my sister and her husband have 2 kids, and he had a very clear. Funny, it was him, not her, but had a very clear experience with both children of when they entered the womb. And in some traditions, it's said that it's usually not until the end of the first trimester or something, and which has interesting implications for the whole argument about abortion and stuff. I mean, we won't go there, but it's sort of interesting to ponder the more metaphysical dimensions of that. But anyway, I don't know. I just felt like bringing it up to see.
Yeah.
And you did have a story about it, so that was interesting.
And I was lucky. It was a lovely experience. And then obviously throughout my diary, Dear Poppyseed, there's all kinds of experiences, like I say, the very physical, day-to-day cravings and sickness, as well as the more spiritual and empowering things, as well as things I learned, because I learned an awful lot. A pregnancy, the 9 months, you need it to get ready and to prepare and to get your head into a better place, because there's always remnants of some rubbish up there that needs sorting out, and pregnancy really helped straighten a lot of my rubbish out.
That's interesting. I never considered that. I mean, obviously your body starts going through a lot of stuff, and a lot of women, like Kate Middleton and all, with the vomiting, and your body's undergoing an adjustment. But I never thought of it in terms of the mind undergoing an adjustment.
Oh, you've got to get ready. Well, I mean, I suppose because I like to think I'm quite a conscious person, I'm a spiritual person, I want to be the best vessel that I can be for my child, but I also want to be prepared for when she comes out, and I'm not talking prepared as in having enough diapers, I'm talking I want to be the right person for her, and I want to be the best person for her. And so there were things that we had, my husband as well had to work through. My husband and I talk about this in the book, had a very, very, very rocky period not long before I got pregnant with Ivy. We kind of worked through that together as a couple, but then when I was pregnant, he had to then work on his stuff more, and I had to work on my stuff separately and as a couple, to make sure that we were happy, we were in a good place, we were, in a loving relationship. And there's a whole lot of transformation needs to go on in those 9 months, whilst baby is brewing and growing, there's also a whole lot of stuff going on mentally and emotionally with the parents.
Yeah, interesting. It's like nature is kind of like molding you to be ready for this. And it's just like we were saying earlier, when spirituality dawns, then the personality undergoes a lot of changes. Well, it sounds like the same thing happens with pregnancy. It's like, okay, this is going to happen, so you're going to get ready. Here, I'm going to put you through this kind of change and that kind of change.
Yeah, put you through a ringer.
Yeah. Huh. And your husband, incidentally, is a rock musician, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, just thought I'd mention that for kicks.
Super Evolver is his band.
Huh.
And his music's, it's definitely, it's got a spirit. I think any musician has got a spiritual influence to their music, whether they recognize it or not, or whether they were completely high maybe when they were writing it. I think that even then they're probably connected to something. But I think any artist or creative person is connected, even whether, like I say, whether they recognize it or not. So we kind of get on in that creative sense.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so we've covered a bunch of stuff. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to bring out before we wrap it up?
Did I mention how much I loved Ivy?
No. Who's Ivy? You mean that plant that grows up the side of walls?
Oh my God. No, I can't think of anything else, to be honest. My brain's not there all the time. This is the most I've been talking about spirituality in a long time, but it's been a pleasure.
It's kind of like you shouldn't eat when you have a full stomach because your stomach needs the blood and not your brain. So maybe you shouldn't give interviews when you've just had a baby because all the blood's in your heart, all the energy's in your heart.
Yeah.
No, but this has been great. I've really enjoyed this, and it's we've discussed some things that I haven't discussed in any other interview, and it gets a little tedious, the same old non-duality stuff. But it's nice to explore some other dimensions of spirituality and talk about motherhood. We haven't, not that I'm an expert, but you are, and I have that hasn't been brought up in any of these interviews. So, and it's coincidentally, there was some young mother that just emailed me just last week that said, "Oh God, this is so difficult, and I'm so tired, and it's so exhausting, and all that stuff." So maybe for her alone, this will be valuable.
Well, for her, it is tiring. It is tiring. You know, I'm warbling on about how amazing and wonderful and incredible it is, but oh my God, it's tiring. You know, I've never been tired like it, but it gets easier. I don't know how old her baby is, but it does get easier, and you just get on with it because it goes so quickly. You know, Ivy's gone from like this big, and now she's this sort of big and is nearly walking, and you just got to take pleasure in it all. Try to take pleasure in it all as much as you can, even the really tough bits, even the waking up in the middle of the night and singing.
I do that with our cat, you know, so what the heck.
Yeah, and it, you know, each child, whether you have more than one or whatever, but each child only happens once, and you know, it's all experience, and it all helps us to grow, and hopefully what I've said about how much I've grown will help that lady.
I think it will, and help a lot of other people. So great. So let me just wrap it up. I've been speaking with Alice Grist, and if you've listened to the whole interview, you know a lot about her, so I don't need to rehash it. But I will be linking to her website from batgap.com, and also linking to her books on Amazon in case you'd like to purchase them. And this interview has been one in an ongoing series. They're all archived at batgap.com, BATGAP, and there's several things you'll find there which I always like to mention. One is that a little discussion springs up around each interview, which usually results in anywhere from 100 to nearly 1,000 posts, people chiming in and talking about whatever the interview inspires. There's a little tab there you can click on to sign up and be notified by email every time a new interview is posted, so feel free to do that. There's a donate button that I appreciate people clicking if they have the wherewithal. It's kind of necessary for this whole thing to keep rolling. There is a link to an audio podcast, so that if you prefer to listen to this on an iPod or an MP3 player rather than have to sit in front of your computer and watch the video of it, you can subscribe to that. So that's just about it. So thanks again, Alice. It's been great.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks to those who've been listening or watching, and we'll see you next week.